and welcome back to Frankly Speaking. I'm your host, Frank. Okay, guys, a little just side update here. I want to talk about a few different things that have kind of crossed my mind, and maybe you guys can help me out as I think about things and make sure my historical methodology is correct in my approach and how I view things. Because I do watch other historians on YouTube and other outlets as well too. And it's fascinating to watch this World War II history, and particularly when I look at figures like Benito Mussolini, Italian fascism in that era, which is something of a personal fascination of mine. And I try and be as fair and balanced a history as I can from my perspective. And it's interesting in that when I watch other history channels, the methodology is always a little bit different. And I notice oftentimes political biases often come out in these sort of historical channels. Oftentimes you get those of a more, I don't know, what do you want to call it, right of center that often reference David Irving as the main historian that sort of contradicts the mainline narrative of World War II, especially on the German front. And then you got another side that obviously attacks that narrative and takes either more of a progressive slant or even a libertarian slant. And it's fascinating to watch these history channels and how they approach history themselves. And I know there's one history channel. It's called, I think it's, what is it? Tick History. And he's an interesting guy. I've watched a few of his videos, but he comes at it from a very libertarian perspective. And you see it really play out in his videos and obviously trying to give historical descriptions of characters and how they come across historically with the link to socialism and ultimately Marxism, which in that libertarian sort of classical liberal mindset is sort of an anathema, right? And the moment you put these characters in these camps, you really have chosen sort of your historical line of thinking and how you want to present these characters. And in the case of lots of libertarian think, especially the von Mises school, obviously that makes these characters very nefarious. And I find it interesting because I used to be a classical liberal, and when I was very young, I considered myself a libertarian to a certain extent. I could never fully commit to the sort of the moral degradation of libertarians, especially that Reason TV sort of slant on libertarianism. But in terms of economics, at one time, it's the way I saw things, and for many years, being that classical liberal camp, I subscribe to the ideas of limited government, get government out of our lives, and government is no good, it's inefficient, and it causes problems, and then it proclaims itself to be the saviors of those problems in society. And certainly, there's a lot of truth to those ideas and those principles that I still agree with. But for me, I've learned after, 30 plus years now of studying politics that, that libertarian world, it's a utopia. Whether you can believe in it, that's fine. I'm not saying you can't believe in it, but these libertarian societies, these loosely sort of put together sort of constructs, it's problematic in so many ways. And so while I still agree with a lot of libertarian tendencies, especially in terms of economics, I realize that in many ways they're not possible. They've never really been lived up to in many ways. And if they have, it's been short stints of history where government has ultimately come in and taken control. So my approach on history has always been one more of practicality. And admittedly, my politics have changed over the past decade, or maybe just over a decade, as I left the classical liberal camp and started to see some of the fallacies of classical liberal economics and politics that always become a contradiction in the end, and in effect give us bigger government and facilitate socialism and Marxism ultimately to take over any classical liberal society. And I think this is important when we study history because not every culture can universally accept these sort of Anglo-Protestant, libertarian as classical liberal principles. Every society is unique, and this is very different. Every society is different, has its own circumstances, has its own history, own culture, own bloodlines, own ancestry, own religion, own faith, and that has to be reflected in sort of the grander scope of history. And this is why, for me, when I come at history, the love of history, I come at it not from a classical liberal or libertarian or far leftist or communist. I do come at it from my own slant. And that is, I come at it from a Catholic perspective. And I see things a little bit different than your typical libertarian. Now, libertarians are going to call me a socialist at the very least, right? When I say that, for example, that at times you need collectivization. You need communal efforts. You need communities that come together and work together for the greater good. And this is always the delicate balance, right, between, sort of government and the give and take with the people and who has more power and how do we limit power and when does it go too far? And I will admit it is a delicate balance at times, but I also understand that in societies that never fully fostered strong economies for, well, many reasons, whether it's wars, whether it's lack of resources, whether it's faith, religion, and culture that play an effect on sort of the larger elements of society, I give those cultures, those societies, those nations a little leeway there without condemnation. This is why, for me, when I study Italian fascism, while its origins concerned me, while its origins were troubling in that it was born out of liberalism, and you go back to the philosophers like Hegel and all these guys, where some of this stuff may have come from. That's fine, I get it. I'm not much of a philosopher. I'm a guy that reacts to history and understanding society and culture, especially Catholic cultures. And what I understood about fascism, just in a general sense, was that it rose at a time where the Anglo-Protestant world and the Bolsheviks from the East were making a strong play for Western Europe, primarily targeting those Catholic nations. If you don't understand this, if you don't see it from this context, then you're never going to understand what happened in Italy and how they tried to deal with some of these problems. And you could sit here and tell me that Benito Mussolini was a socialist because he implemented a pension plan for senior citizens, because he implemented a plan to help foster material and economic support to families. And you could say that he was a socialist. And I guess if I'm a libertarian sense, yeah, you could probably make that argument. But I also understand that that's the way the modern world was also going. Because while that plan was being implemented in Italy, it was also being implemented in the liberal republics. And it was being implemented in the Bolshevik nations too, to a certain degree. And so the question is, can this sort of libertarian-esque attitude ever work in nations in Western Europe? Societies that were constructed different, particularly in Italy, that was deeply Catholic, and societies that struggled economically because they were not in the right geographical location to take full advantage of the turn of the century industrial revolution, where nations like Russia, America had just really an unlimited amount of resources. The British Empire used colonization long before nations like Italy and Germany even came into existence in the mid 1800s. And the British, they were bullies, let's put it that way, to get what they wanted all over the world. Remember, they had an empire where the sun never set. And so they dealt with sort of the post-industrial revolution era by massive colonization. So did the French, so did the Dutch, right? So did a lot of nations. And here comes Italy, and here comes Germany, these two newer nations after revolutions in the late 1800s, and now they find themselves in the world where the empires of the West, America, and the empire of the East, the Soviets, have already been established or were being established in the process in that sense. And the other superpowers of the world were just colonizing everywhere. And by the time, for example, Italy comes around and decides to get to colonization in the early 1900s, it's really late to the game, as all the major, I guess, prizes of colonial territories have been occupied. And so, when you look at it from that perspective, you say to yourself, okay, what do you do in the world that's you're far behind on? You're not partaking of the greater colonization. You have a newer nation. You're trying to figure out what your identity is on top of it all. Because remember, for example, with Italy after unification, you still have the problem of, okay, what's an Italian in many respects? As these were local regions, local provinces. Even after the Risorgimento, you got a situation where the Pope doesn't even recognize the Italian state. The Pope is angry for losing the papal lands. And see, these are the nuances of history that really matter, and how things broke down in Italy, for example, much different in America. That really, you get the colonial powers, or you get the colonies, and then immediately, Thomas Jefferson makes the Louisiana Purchase, and we're going out west, and there's not much of a challenge in regards to territories conquered, unlike Europe, which is it's a continent that's been civilized for several thousand years now. It's a little bit more complex over there. And so for the Americans that have a vast amount of land and resources, listen, things like libertarianism to a certain degree could work a little bit better. In principle, it could work. And even in America, it never really worked. It really fell apart pretty quickly as government grew and grew and grew. And as I told my libertarian friends and my conservative friends for so long, if you can't govern and keep control of these loosely based societies or loosely based social connections that you believe are the grand prize of civilization, then your ideology means nothing at the end of the day. I'm not quite sure as to the constructs of the British Empire, but considering the British Empire was always considered like a massive bank that simply delegated, again, resources all over the world, and the ideas of capitalism and the ideas of market economics in many ways largely came from the British Empire. It was probably something akin to America in many respects. Obviously, they dealt with the monarchy there, and they had to overthrow the monarchy, or at least, lessen its power at the time. But again, we're dealing with the traditions of Anglo Protestants, whether it's England or all of its offshoots, which is America, which was Canada, which was Australia, which was New Zealand, right? They shared many of the same common values. And ultimately, because they were Protestants on top of it all. And with Protestantism, a lot of these things are much more loosey-goosey than Catholic nations, where usury, well, it's a sin in Catholic nations. Where in Protestant nations, it's not a sin. You can put your people in sort of this, destitute of debt of sorts, and not have any more qualms about it, right? When you just say it's an individual choice. They made their choices. Sure, we might have manipulated the money. Sure, we might have moved a few things around that made it beneficial for the upper classes. But at the end of the day, we gave everybody individual responsibility. Catholic nations take a little bit of approach because they saw the shenanigans of the bankers. They saw the shenanigans of the usury system. And this is why you can argue, and this is disputable, I think, but you can argue that those Catholic economies were a little bit slower because they didn't take up usury in that sense, because they didn't want to indebt people. This is why, in many ways, European Catholic nations developed much deeper, richer cultures. The faith was always much more vibrant as Protestant nations liberalized at a really rapid pace. In Western Europe, those Catholic nations, they were slower economically, but culturally they were richer. Families were stronger. Foods, art, everything was much richer there because all this takes time to cultivate. when you view society as the Anglo-Protestants did, as simply acquiring material wealth and the economic sort of, what do you want to call it, apparatus in order to acquire stuff without deep roots in faith, deep roots in religion, deep roots in culture, deep roots in ancestry, art, beauty, everything that matters to Catholic nations, you're fundamentally going to have different values. So that's why it's interesting, because I'm not sure if Tick history, if I believe he's British. I could be wrong. I don't know what he is, but if if you're judging history from a British perspective and saying, look at us, hoorah, we're much more prosperous, much more, we got a better sort of metrics to get us to live by these libertarian metrics. Well, fine, fine. But how have you articulated culture, faith, family? Have you? Listen, I'm not here to dump on all the British people. That's not my goal here. But my point is, it is a different way of life with different values. And so that's why for me, and I'll tell you again, the fascination with Italian fascism, and even Mussolini for that part, not because I think fascism was some great novel innovation or some great some great political system, but that Mussolini especially allowed for Catholic culture to flourish within the realm of fascism. They made the necessary adjustments, first to account for culture, family, and the faith, which to me is everything. And as an integralist, this is what I'm looking for. Now, I don't believe fascism or Italian fascism can ever be revived. It was very unique for its time, for the particular place in Italy, and particularly for that figure, Benito Mussolini, who made fascism what I believe fascism was at the time. Remember, at one point, Benito said, I don't follow fascism, fascism follows me. Because there was an evolution of Mussolini, which has to be taken into account. And you see this, most obviously with Benito bringing in the church through the Lateran Accords, which I'm sure had to upset many of the original fascist philosophers, which I don't think liked the Catholic Church very much. Even Benito in his youth didn't like the Catholic Church very much. He was very anti-clerical. But when it came down to it, when he saw the importance of the faith, when he saw the importance of this identity that Italians needed associated with the church, and he could use it to unify Italy, a sort of a loosely, what do you want to call it, disunited, sort of weak central monarchy, he grabbed a hold of it, and this is what he used. And to me, this was the game changer as I studied this, because as an integralist, to me, I see no political systems as the gold standard. I don't worship at the altar of any political system, not the American system, not the British system, obviously not Marxism in any kind of way, or even fascism. But what I'm looking for is a political system that is open to the natural law and open to the church. I am an integralist. I believe that the world, the West, was its healthiest when the church played an integral role in Western civilization. And this is what I see in Italy in 1920s and 30s. And I see it because I come from there. My family is from there. I understood the culture. I understood the values. I understood the time, because that's what was translated to me. And for me, it was unique because I'm not 2 and 3 and 4 generation immigrant here, right? I'm first generation. My parents came in 1964, which means in many ways I got stuck in a time warp, because the Italy that was sort of transferred onto me from my parents and grandparents was the Italy of the 1930s, 40s, and 50s, because that's when my family resided in Italy in those times. And it was that world. It was a pre-sexual revolution Italy. Yes, part of it was under Benito Mussolini. Some of it right after the war in and of itself. In fact, so much am I in a time warp in many ways that my dialect is fading out because it's a dialect that was brought over in the 1960s. And while Italy after the war moved on to become more centralized with a more deeper Italian language, we continue to speak the old Sicilian dialect, right? That's why it's difficult for me to understand some Italian. If you watch The Godfather, part two, when Michael goes back to Sicily. Man, they're speaking some old school Sicilian dialect that I understand completely. That was my generation back then. But that film was again in 1970s. That's the dialect that was being spoken. That dialect has started to die out, and now it kind of resides here in America through my family. But as my parents' generation begins to die off, that language is going to start to die off, right? So this is my ultimate point. I think we're all products of our time. And I judge history in that same manner. I judge it through my experiences, through my eyes, through my culture, through my faith, through my ancestry. And I just see things that are a little bit different when they're being described by libertarians whose only emphasis is on sort of this pseudoscience, right? Make sure we get the proper metrics straight, right? The sciences straight. In many ways, it's leftist that only focuses on the science aspect of economics, where everything is simply an economic theory. And this is why, again, these societies that have adopted some forms of pseudo-libertarianism, again, it's never really played out in totality because even in those societies, governments grow and grow and grow. But, it's all about this economic or this scientific formula. If we get this straight, we got this utopia. But what they don't take into account is fallen human nature. They don't take account concupiscence. They don't take into account a culture, society, faith, religion, and how people may rebel against those ideas simply because they go against sort of everything that makes us, these wonderful social human beings, right? And that's a problem for many libertarians, right? With this idea of this extreme individualism where we all got our gun and we all got our little piece of land, and I'm going to take care of myself in this rugged individualism, which was really the idea of the West, right? The idea of late 1800s, early 1900s America that was internalized by many Americans. And that's fine if you want to hold that vision. But not all societies are built that way, especially when you're interconnected by a faith like Catholicism that's not individualistic like Protestantism, where it's a faith where we are, again, a congregation. We are one body in Christ. And how do we react to one another and how do we coexist with one another? Our interrelationships, right? This is why family is so important in a place like Italy or Spain and all these Catholic nations, where in Protestant nations, they de-emphasize the family for individualism, right? And that's why a lot of times these libertarian principles, they don't make sense. They don't operate to a lot of Catholic societies. They don't work in my mind. Now, obviously, there's a danger with the growth of government. But as I've said before, with Catholic nations, authoritarian governments, listen, they're always a problem, but they're less of a problem. Because as long as we have the natural law, the moral law of the church in place, it is a true check and balance on government. We don't have that in the Western liberal republics. We have abstract kind of ideas through these constitution, these philosophical constitutions that are supposed to maintain a balance of power. But when you don't have an outside entity, when you don't have a moral force, when you don't have a greater force to keep government in check, those separation of powers simply become a governmental social club where they all simply got each other's backs. And that's what we see. That's why the separation of powers in America doesn't make sense. Well, I do like in America the division of powers and the construction of the three branches. I think it's a good system. I think it's Catholic in origin in many ways. The problem is they removed the moral law from the Constitution because they were Protestants. They were Protestants. And as Protestantism devolved, the Constitution was only going to break down and devolve with it. And this is why once we get to the 14th Amendment, the Protestant national churches in each state, the state churches, they all dissolve. And once those state churches dissolve, here comes the moral collapse of America. We go through the gay 20s, straight into the sexual revolution, 1960s, and here we are in 2024, and the culture has become absolutely mad. It's gone batshit crazy, excuse my language. And it's not too hard to see why. See? But you look at other European nations, Catholic nations, they resisted liberalism for a long time. Now, they would eventually succumb because after the war, liberalism was infused. Well, it's actually both Marxism and liberalism. They were both infused in those societies, right? And they would be overcome. But I came from, you know, or at least my family did, and the world and the values that I was raised in the 1930s, 40s, and 50s. Those are the values I was raised in. And Italy, during the reign of Benito Mussolini, was devoutly Catholic. There wasn't too many. I don't want to hear about Non abbiamo bisogno. I explained that. It's overdone by many critics of Mussolini. The church had its place in Italian society because I lived it. I was raised in it. Trust me, guys, it was a good, strong, healthy society. So this is what I say. This is why history to me is a little bit different. I'm more pragmatic. I'm willing to consider culture. I'm willing to consider faith, ancestral roots. I'm willing to consider geographical locations. What are the politics? What's the history of the politics? Things of that nature. And not simply come at it from a political standpoint where history has to fit my political paradigm of sorts. And so I think that's just simply the point that I wanted to make is, this is why I think you get contrasting views on history and how people approach history and the definitions of history in many ways. Was Mussolini a socialist? I guess you could say that if, pension plans and, paying women to have children, sure, you could say that. But what nation wasn't doing that at the time? Everybody was going in that direction. Liberalism had given rise to the growth of secular government at the time. But at the same time, you have to be fair and acknowledge that Mussolini had a growth. He abandoned Marxism. Fascism and Marxism were different. Fascists did not persecute the proletariat. They did not collectivize on a massive scale like the Marxists did. They did not take private property from people. They did not destroy the faith. They did not destroy the Catholic culture. They worked with it, is what they did. These things all matter. There's a bunch of other stuff as well, too. But my point is not to acknowledge the differences between these two societies that were at war with one another, right? And to come at it from, again, an Anglo-Protestant perspective that's across the ocean and doesn't understand the inherent values of a Catholic society that's trying to maintain its cultural hegemony and its faith because it values that up above and beyond simply economic material success, then you're not going to see what was going on in Italy. This is why the next Mussolini part I'm working on is the relationship between Mussolini and Hilaire Bloch. I recorded already. It's got to do some editing on it. But, Hilaire Bloch saw the wonderful things that were happening in the 1920s and 30s. He did. He acknowledged it. And Bloch was done with sort of the British parliamentary system, how corrupt it was, and how the oligarchs had taken over, how the little guy was being crushed. And yet in Italy, they were trying to address some of these issues. So again, coming at it from a libertarian utopia, when I see a libertarian utopia actually be created on Earth and maintain control and power for a significant amount of years, then I'll start to believe that it can be done. Until then, it has never happened. And so to be lectured to by a bunch of, libertarians on history and the nuances of history, just a little bit tough for me to take. I'm not a fan of that kind of stuff. And so there you have it, guys. Just a little update. That's all I'm doing here. And I'm kind of trying to explain my methodology on history. Practical guy, I consider the time, the place, the culture, the faith, the religion, the history. I put it all into context. and I will tell you exactly how I see things, where it came from, what are the origins of it. And I also take a very deep personal element to it. I look at the characters, the persons in history. What were their goals? What were they doing? How they may have their ideas may have changed in time, and how all that played out. And that's what I always try to do. So, anyways, that's it. Little side update, sort of my historical methodology. I hope it makes sense, guys. There you have it. I want to thank you for joining me. This is Frank signing off for Frank Speaking. Good night, everybody.